Good morning. Well, I am on the West Coast, but good afternoon to everybody on the East Coast and other time zones. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. My name is Anil Inamdar, as Beth mentioned, and I'm the VP and Global Head of Data Solutions for Instaclustr. The topic of my presentation is open source or open core, what needs to be evaluated before diving in. For the past couple of decades, open source software has come a long way, and now an integral part of every enterprise architecture. But it has also become more complex in terms of licensing, governance, branding, and ecosystem, and that is what we'll talk in this presentation. So let me start with a brief history of open source. I don't want to spend too much time on it. Just for some context. So the open source movement was essentially kicked off by Richard Stallman in 1984 when he founded the Free Software Foundation, FSF. It was a revolution against the proprietary software. In 1985, the GNU Public License GPL was officially announced. 10 years later, a milestone event occurred in the open source world. Linux 1.0 was released under GPL by Linus Torvalds. 1998, Netscape released its software as free software. The term open source was used for the first time. 2003, Linux OS and Apache Web Server, they become mainstream. And ever since, the progress continues. All right, so let's talk about the progression of open source ecosystem through the years. I have come up with this division. It's not scientific. I just came up with these three divisions just for me to understand, and it kind of helps others to kind of put everything in perspective in terms of timeline. So I am calling the first wave of open source as the beginning. Okay, as we saw from the previous slide, there was a revolution in 1980s and 1990s in the software development. It was primarily against the closed source community. Individual collaborators worked asynchronously on projects that they were passionate about. The initial licensing model was completely free, with the caveat that there may not be support or an immediate fix to a bug. Linux and MySQL are pretty good, two good examples. The next wave started somewhere in 2000. I'm calling it expansion. The software in this case was built with commercial customers in mind. It was typically developed in a company in the beginning and was later moved to the foundation. Hadoop was started in Yahoo, Kafka in LinkedIn, Cassandra in Facebook. The core software was free, but several vendors started offering enhancements and could charge licensing fees. Along with enhancements, these vendors also supported their versions of the product. The current wave has attained some level of maturity. It is going after enterprise customers, and cloud is playing an integral part of the offering. In this wave, the software contributors are primarily from a commercial business. The licensing model is like the expansion phase, but the cloud vendors have their own take on it. The popularity of open source, I think the popularity of open source has been growing constantly while the closed source is declining. This chart is only for the database technologies, but similar trends have been observed in other domains too. So why open source? What does open source bring to the table? So these are some of the advantages of open source. I have grouped them into 6. Obviously, there are many. I will quickly go through each one of them. The first one is economies of scale. This is the most widely used advantage or widely cited advantage of open source. There is no licensing, there's no vendor lock-in, there's no technology lock-in, faster time to market. Security, next one. So there was a time when open source software was considered not very secure, and the security team had a lot of things to say about open source when people were trying to implement open source, but that is no longer the case. Okay, and the reason is that as more people use and test, more loopholes are found. Okay, there is safety in numbers, and as there's a law you might have heard, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Third is intellectual property. So open source foundations, they provide flexible licensor like Apache. So enterprise benefit from the clarity and the transparency of this licensing. Another is scalability and reliability. So the software is peer reviewed, so it becomes very reliable. Also, when large enterprises adopt and start using the software, it becomes even more robust and scalable. Another advantage is supportive community. This is kind of the lifeblood of open source software community. A thriving, vibrant communities, they work on their projects with common purpose and passion. Apache Software Foundation has over 8,000 committers at this time. Last but not the least is innovation. Now, when you're using proprietary software and you want a new feature in that software, or you have a peculiar use case, okay, for which the current software does not have a solution, you have to depend on the proprietary vendor, okay, to come up with a solution. That is not the case with open source, okay. You can decide the direction. In fact, you can start adding that feature on your own and kind of inspire the community to help you with it. So that's a really big advantage that open source software has against the proprietary software. Many of you might have heard this Bill Joy's law. No matter who you are, most of the smartest people work for someone else. So why not use them through community? So what is open core? So far we've talked about open source. So like, what is this open core? Now, as open source is free, how can you make money? So a popular business model came into being called open core. Open core is a business model to monetize free open source software. The core of the software is open with added proprietary features. So open source is always a project, while open core could be a product. Open core exploited some of the challenges with the open source, like the absence of support or needs of features like monitoring or auto provisioning. Open core is successfully exploited by vendors like Cloudera, DataStax, and Confluent. But that's not the whole story. I think, let me go to the next slide, and that'll clarify what I'm saying. So I believe that open core is continuously marching towards the proprietary world. So first, the support gap is exploited, then the feature gap. And finally, the delivery model is changed to provide serverless or cloud-based solutions. And ultimately, it becomes another proprietary company or proprietary solution. But open source does not stay quiet. Okay. It constantly upgrades and fills the gap. First, the feature gap, and then the delivery model alternatives. This is something to think about and ponder about, because when you're deciding between open source and open core, realize that open core at some point is always moving towards proprietary model, while open source always remains open source. So what are some of the items that we must consider while deciding between open source and open core? So there are 5 considerations, and we'll talk about those. So there are 5 items I want to discuss: licensing, governance, brand, business model, and ecosystem. So first is licensing. All right, so now, even though we are talking about free open source projects, somebody still owns the copyright in all the code. Now, exactly who owns the copyright in what capacity can be complicated and will depend on project structure, but somebody does own the copyright of the code. Now, license is a mechanism for anybody to use the code. A license is how the copyright holder provides permission for other people to use the code they hold copyright in. Open source licenses are generally perpetual, but the copyright holder can change the license with new versions. Now, open source licensing has several nuances and are really complicated. Now, this is from Wikipedia and just meant to show the complexity. So don't get scared. We're going to simplify the spreadsheet for you. All right. So for all practical purposes, you can focus on this summary. There are primarily three types of licenses that you should be aware of. The first is the permissive license. This allows broad free use and modification with minimal obligation. The challenge is that one can modify and add proprietary features not offered by the open source software and charge money for it. Now, some of the examples of this licensing are Apache 2.0, used by Cassandra, Kafka, and other projects. The second type of license is copyleft license. So we have copyright and then there's copyleft. Now, this also allows broad free use, but requires any modifications to be made public under the same license, which is not true for the permissive license. Now, this is often prohibited by corporate open source policies. An example of this license is GPL or Mozilla Public License. The third type of license is a custom license. In this case, the holder can do whatever they want. It's an open source license, but the holder can do whatever they want. This type of license is increasingly used by open core companies to protect themselves against AWS and other cloud providers with provisions against deploying as a managed service. Example is SSPL, the server-side public license used by MongoDB and Elastic.co. All right, the next item is governance. So now you have some knowledge about licensing, but how is the project governed? Who has the power to make decisions? Well, ultimately, the project or the license owner gets to decide what changes go into the code base. This could be a foundation. In this case, the foundation provides open governance and decision-making. Some examples are Apache Foundation, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF, and these are non-profit foundations. The owner could also be a corporation or could be a profit-making company. In this case, they have unilateral decision-making ability as to what changes to accept and if they want to charge the license for future versions. Elastic.co is a copyright holder for Elasticsearch, although it is significantly based on Apache Lucene. Okay, next item is brand. So who owns the brand or the logo? Now, the brand is the logo that goes along with the software, like Cassandra, Kafka, Spark, as you can see on the screen. It is not critical for making decisions to use this software, but it confuses everyone, and it kind of warrants at least a brief discussion. It usually goes hand in hand with governance. The three logos on the top are owned by Apache Foundation, a nonprofit entity, while the logos for MariaDB and Scylla are owned by corporations or profit-making company, even though they are open source. So that's the difference. You can have an open source license, but you can still be a commercial company. Similarly, logos for open source Drupal is owned by an individual, okay, Dries Buytaert, as BDFL, Benevolent Dictator for Life. So as you can see, there are different variations of using this brand. Some are owned by foundations, some are by commercial companies, some are by individuals. All right, so now we know something about licensing and governance, but what are different types of business models that exist in the open source domain? All right, the first business model, which probably is not a business model, is pure open source. In this case, community and key corporations are working on the project with no financial incentive. For example, Apple and Netflix invest heavily in the Cassandra open source project, and with the sole purpose of enhancing the project to benefit their use case. The next model is open core business model. These vendors generally want to keep the core strong, but have a big interest in protecting the value in their proprietary extensions. For example, DataStax for Cassandra or Confluent for Kafka. The next business model is open source IP owner. These vendors may have open source license and the code may be completely transparent, but as they own the IP, the open source mantle is used as marketing. Most of the committers of the project are also from the vendor owning the IP. Examples are Elastic.co and Scylla. The last model is by cloud providers. They focus mostly on operations and delivery of the product with minimal investment in the community. They try to reap the benefits of the open source with their ability to scale and their reliability. Elastic.co recently changed its licensing to compete with AWS hosting solution. I'm going to discuss the Elastic.co example later in the presentation. These are some of the white papers if you want to find out more about this. All right, ecosystem. So another key item we must consider while evaluating open source is ecosystem. Many of the open source projects have related components that are not integrated with the original project, but are complementary. Along with these related components, the ecosystem also refers to the community, resources, and long-term perspectives for these projects. So ecosystem. So ecosystem is healthy if many large corporations are contributing to the open source projects. They can provide assurance of future stability. Example I already gave you, Apple and Netflix are major contributors to Cassandra. So it's going to remain stable and reliable for quite some time. Another item is availability of consultants and people providing integrated solutions for open source. This also provides stability. Many times, a key software is identified together with related open source components. This can also provide stability. Now let's see an example on the next page. This is for Kafka, Confluent Kafka, which is an open core product, versus Apache Kafka, which is an open source project. As you can see from the table, many of the proprietary components of Confluent Kafka have almost one-to-one open source alternatives. For replications and mirroring, we have Mirror Maker 2. There are several open source connectors available. There are almost solutions for monitoring like Prometheus. So for each and every proprietary feature, there is almost one-to-one corresponding solution, open source solution. Okay, so now that we have learned about some of the consideration, let's look at a recent development in the open source market regarding Elasticsearch. So Elasticsearch began using Apache 2.0 license. Now Elastic.co experimented with mixed tree licensing. I don't want to go too much detail into that. The governance and the decisions were made by Elastic.co, a commercial company. So the license was open source, but the decisions maker was a commercial company. So Elastic.co made money by providing hosting services plus proprietary add-ons. Now AWS started offering a similar hosting service for Elasticsearch, undercutting Elastic.co. So therefore, Elastic.co changed its licensing model from Apache 2.0 to SSPL, server-side public license. So basically, AWS could no longer use Elasticsearch going forward. But AWS did not keep quiet. So what it did, it forked the then version of Elasticsearch along with Netflix and started a new project called OpenSearch. So now we have two choices, for Elasticsearch, one from Elastic.co and another from AWS, Netflix, and the community called OpenSearch. I just wanted to give this example to kind of to shed some light on the complexity of licensing and all the dynamics that go along with it. Okay, some of the popular open source software. Cassandra, the licensing is Apache 2.0. The governance is nonprofit organization. Now, DataStax Cassandra, on the other hand, for core software, it's Apache 2.0. But for all the proprietary features, okay, they have proprietary license, and it's a commercial company, it's a profit-making company. Kafka, same thing, Apache 2.0. Governance is again nonprofit. Confluent Kafka, Same as Cassandra, Apache 2.2 for core and proprietary. And again, it's a commercial company. MariaDB is GPL version 2, but again, it's a commercial company. Scylla, same thing. GNU GPL, commercial company. Drupal is GPL version 2. It's again non-profit company. Just to give you a flavor of what kind of software and what kind of licensing and governance is there in the open source market. All right, now, so let's look at like a 100% open source company like Instaclustr and its operation to understand the nuances. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide, okay, and just go directly into what Instaclustr does. That is my company. So how do we deliver? To really simplify things, the technologies at the bottom, Cassandra, Kafka, Elasticsearch, Redis, Spark. Actually, I should add Postgres. We just added Postgres there. That is what we support. And what services do we offer? Those are at the top of the slide. We offer consulting, we offer support, and we offer managed platform. So if you have a Cassandra cluster and you want to ensure that it is supported, if there's a problem, if there's a bug, and you need to have a patch, we can support that for you. Or we can manage the entire cluster for you in our platform or any of the cloud platforms. The middle section of the slide are our differentiators. Okay, so basically we offer full lifecycle solutions, starting from strategy to architecture to development, implementation, training, support, and if required, managed platform. As I said already, our solutions are 100% open source. Okay, there is no licensing, there's no lock-in. Operations first. What does that mean? That means we are not the people who wrote Cassandra or Kafka or Elasticsearch, but when it comes to operations, we are the best. Okay? In fact, for Cassandra, Apache Cassandra, we are the #1 operators in the world. We also offer certified and tested builds of this software. And also we'll fill gaps with open source ecosystem. So if you're working with a particular client and we find that a particular open source software has a bug, we will patch that bug for you and then work with the community to upload that to the actual software. So those are our differentiating factors. So we offer the technologies at the bottom, the services at the top, and the middle section are our differentiators. Okay, so sometimes a visual comparison is useful when we are comparing open core software with open source software. So here on the left is what an organization's experience would look like if they use a lot of open core software. So first, there are multiple vendors and multiple licenses for Cassandra, for MongoDB, for Kafka, Redis, and Elasticsearch. For each of these technologies, it'll be difficult for customers to know when they are being locked in because it's often unclear which features are free and which require licensing. This is a defining feature of the open core model. Now, alternatively, here is a visual of an organization's experience if they use pure open source and partnered with Instaclustr. There are no licensing fees. It's a single vendor, and instead of proprietary features that commit you to a long-term license fees, you can leverage the open source ecosystem to fill any gaps that exist in the open source project. So this is a brief platform overview. On the top, we have the open source technology that we support, and I should add a Postgres there. In the bottom, we have all the cloud platforms where we can host those technologies. It could be any cloud, AWS, GCP, Azure, or on-prem. And in the middle, we have all the services that we can provide for each of these technologies: provisioning, monitoring, scaling, security, backup, recovery, and everything. A bit of company overview. So we were founded in 2013. It's an Australian-based company, started in Canberra. We have over 250 employees now. We have 4 offices headquartered in Redwood City, California. We have 24/7 tech ops and dev team in Australia and in USA. We have over 300 customers with several known names, as you can see. So in conclusion, so if you want to use 100% open source technologies, there are a few rule of thumbs. Okay, use open source technologies if you want to continue using open source software and not move towards proprietary software. So if you have committed to open source and not proprietary, yes, then open source is your way to go, and don't go with open core. If you don't want to pay software licensing cost, okay, so if you're using open source, there is no licensing cost. If you're using open core, the core is free, okay, but the features will be added cost. So be aware of that. If you want to avoid vendor locking, if you avoid technology locking, open source is a no-brainer. If you want to be a part of open source community, then yes, use open source software. And if you want to continue to innovate your solution and not depend on the proprietary vendors timeline, okay, if you want to add a new features that is not available in the core, in the open core or proprietary product, okay, you can start adding that feature yourself. You can start working with the community. So that's one big thing that differentiates open source from open core, and those are some of the factors you might want to consider before using open source or open core. To end, I think for this conference we are having a special promotion. We have a 2-hour open source consulting advice, and we are also offering 1 week free access to our Instaclustr platform. You can spin up like a 3-node clusters in like 3 to 5 minutes. It could be a Cassandra, Kafka, Elasticsearch, Redis. It's fairly easy to use. Just mention all things open October 2021 to get all these promotions. So that was my short presentation. Again, if you want to contact me, my email is there on the slide deck. Also, if you want to reach out to Instaclustr, just do that. Take advantage of the promotion that we are offering. Thank you so much, and back to Beth.